evening. On behalf of Arts Empowering Life, welcome to our God of our Fathers, Mighty Miracles of the American Revolution series. My name is Sister Danielle Dwyer, and along with Lillian Meow, we serve as coordinators of this series. As we look toward our country's 250th anniversary, we wanted to raise up moments of divine intervention, incredible moments of faith and courage, moments that revealed and outlined the hand of God over our nation. Each month, starting tonight through July of 2026, there will be a lecture on an event that happened in that month during the Revolution. Tonight is the Battle of Brooklyn that took place in August 1776. We are delighted to have Chris Stewart with us this evening to speak to us about this moment in history. A little bit about him. Chris Stewart is Utah's former 2nd Congressional District Representative and the U.S. House of Representatives. He was raised on a dairy farm in Cache Valley, Utah, as one of 10 children. His career holds a distinctive blend of military service, business leadership, authorship, and public service, with a consistent focus on national security and defense. Chris served for 14 years in the U.S. Air Force, piloting rescue helicopters and B-1 bombers. He and his team earned 3 world speed records, including the record for the fastest nonstop flight around the world. They received the McKay Trophy. Following his military service, he became CEO of the Shipley Group, an environmental and energy consulting firm, and is now the president of Skyline Capital. From 2013 to 2023, Chris represented Utah's 2nd Congressional District and the U.S. House of Representatives. He served on the House Intelligence and Appropriations Committees with active involvement in national security, defense, and technology policy. He is also a prolific author. Chris has written over 17 books, including multiple New York Times bestsellers such as 7 Miracles That Saved America, The Miracle of Freedom, and The Great and Terrible series. 7 Miracles That Saved America he co-authored with his brother Ted and highlights 7 pivotal moments in American history. Among them, the miracle of a summer fog, which recounts a dramatic turn during the Battle of Brooklyn. Now, on a practical note, at the end of Chris's lecture, there will be a chance for questions. Please come to the microphone here in the aisle to ask your questions. And if you are unable to do that, we will bring a microphone to you. Now, please join me in welcoming Chris Stewart.
Sister Dwyer, thank you so much for that great introduction. And just because we are on Zoom, can I just check, are we good with sound and video?
Yes.
I hope so, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. I wish I could be there in person. Travel and other responsibilities made that impossible, but we've set this up, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago, and truly I've been looking forward to it. So thank you and Lillian for the great work in making this possible and for leading this effort. Something which, by the way, I think is a really important endeavor you're doing. I love the topic. I wish every American had a chance to hear these lectures, see your film and the other media. And oh my gosh, I wish our kids knew it as well, because far too many of our children are just not familiar enough with our history and not familiar enough with the miraculous events that have played out through our history. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, why I think that matters. I'd like to elaborate just a little bit on my background, just because I think it's relevant. You see here, I have these Air Force pilot wings. These are not my wings. These are the wings of my father. He was a pilot in World War II. And as you said, I come from a large family, 10 kids. We had, my father and mother had 6 sons, and 5 of us have served in the military. So you can see that it runs kind of deep in our family's DNA. I was talking with a general officer not long ago, and I mentioned that to him. He said, "Well, how many of your children and your nieces and nephews are serving?" I didn't know the answer, and we kind of added it up, and it was about a dozen. Of now the third generation has serving or has served in the military, and I'm very proud of that. And you mentioned my time in Congress. People, I left kind of unexpectedly. I was never one of these people who was going to spend 20 or 30 years in Congress, but I didn't expect to leave when I did. But my wife had a stroke, and she's doing okay, by the way. But I realized after she had her medical incident that, it just wasn't fair for me to be gone all the time, which is what's required when you're in Congress. Of course, you're in DC most of the time. And as you know, as an Air Force pilot, I was gone a lot. And I just knew it was time to go back home and to spend time and a little bit of my energies that I hadn't been able to do before helping take care of Evie. So people ask me, "Do you miss Congress?" And I say, "Hey, truly, not for 5 seconds." It was an honor to serve, and I love the work. But even that is not the most important thing we'll do. The most important thing we'll do is taking care of our families. But I'm grateful for the experience. Before we talk specifically about this really remarkable event, this really miraculous event that happened with the Battle of Brooklyn, which is, by the way, a story that not many people are familiar with. But as I'll try to describe to you tonight, it was truly a miracle. I mean, my gosh, the number of incidents, the unlikely nature of how this thing played out, it's hard to not attribute it to just good luck. It was something more than that, but a lot of people aren't familiar with it. And that's one of the reasons I'm glad we get a chance to talk about it tonight. But again, before I do, I kind of want to set the table to say and to describe a little bit about why it's important. Last night I was flying home, and for the first time in my life, and I fly all the time now, and have it. And by the way, as I said, I was an Air Force pilot. For the first time in my life, we had to abort the takeoff. I mean, we were rolling down the runway almost to lift off, and the pilot suddenly aborted the takeoff. They brought the throttles back and applied the brakes, and it was really kind of fun. It was a little bit of an adventure throwing us forward. I had a chance to talk to the pilots after, but it reminded me of a good friend of mine when I was flying the B-1. He was a guy in our squadron. Everyone liked him. He had a beautiful family, 3 really cute little kids. His name was Vern. The only thing about Vern was he was just remarkably cursed. It's funny, pilots are a little bit of a suspicious lot. And it got so every time you flew with Vern, it was just like a religious experience. I mean, there's only one time that B-1 has had to land with the gear up. And they had to go out to the Mojave Desert and land out on the desert there. And this poor guy was on the aircraft then. One incident, they were in Europe flying, and the B-1 has wings that sweep forward, and then when you go fast and you go down really low over the ground, we'd fly just a few hundred feet off the ground. The wings would sweep aft until they're almost touching the tail. And they were doing a low-level route, flying really fast, really low, I think in the UK. And this was at night, and when they come out of low level and they came up to altitude and tried to slow down, they couldn't bring their wings forward. And so, they did everything they could. The wings wouldn't come forward, which meant they couldn't slow down. They couldn't slow down to land. So they started heading towards Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, which has the longest runway in Europe. And they asked some instructors back in at Dyess Air Force Base in Texas to go to the simulator and practice landing at Ramstein with the wings swept aft. Something no one's clearly ever done before. And they did that. I think they did it 5 times, and 3 times in the simulator, they crashed at the end of the runway. And so the crew was asking, "Well, can we do it?" And these other pilots were saying, "Yeah, I'm sure you can. You're going to be fine." not telling them, like I said, that 3 of the 5 times they couldn't land and stop in time. These guys landed at Ramstein, I think it was 348 miles an hour when they touched down. And it just shredded the tires and started the brakes on fire. But they were able to land at the end of the runway. I tell you, it got so bad with my friend that someone got some African prayer beads. Now, I didn't even know there was such a thing as African prayer beads, but we'd start to pass them around the squadron. It'd be like, "Hey, man, how you doing?" And, "Oh, not good, man, not good at all." It says, well, what's the matter?" "Well, I'm flying with Vern tonight." And, "Oh, man, I'm so sorry." And you got the African prayer beads? "Yeah, I got them right here." And it was kind of a funny joke, but it was also kind of like, yeah, this guy just kind of seems to have bad luck often. Well, so I got transferred and Vern got transferred, and we kind of lost touch with each other. Coming to my point now, this was several years ago. I was actually flying out of Salt Lake City. This was after I'd left the Air Force. And we're sitting there at the gate. We didn't push back, and the pilot announces, "Hey, we got a little problem. We're going to fix it." And I could hear him banging on the it sounded like the landing gear below me, banging with a hammer. And I thought, there aren't that many things on an airplane you can fix by banging on it, but that's what they did. And they banged away a while, and after a while, the pilot comes on and says, "Oh, we got it fixed. We're going to go." And so we took off. We're a little bit late, headed out to DC. And we hit a massive line of thunderstorms. And these thunderstorms stretched from it seems like from Ohio all the way down through South and North Carolina. And air traffic control just couldn't sequence us through the thunderstorm. So we had to hold. So we're just flying really quite high in the air in this constant circle. And it was really turbulent and bumpy. And after a while, with that constant turn and the bumps and, the kind of anxiety, people start getting sick. And I noticed this. I was sitting on the aisle seat, and the woman on the aisle seat across from me and one row up, she started looking for a throw-up bag, a bag to throw up in, and she couldn't find one. And then everyone around her starts looking for one, and they hand it to her. And I mean, oh my gosh, that poor woman started throwing up, and it just went on and on. I mean, she threw up her breakfast, and it seems like she threw up her dinner from the night before. My gosh, it seemed like she threw up a candy bar from the 7th grade. She just kept throwing up. And everyone's like, "Oh no." And then the smell, right? And then other people started throwing up. And it was kind of miserable, actually. We finally got through the weather. We go into Reagan. Reagan Airport's a difficult airport to land in. There's certain security procedures. But this poor pilot just planted this thing down. I mean, we banged onto the runway and bounced a couple times and kind of rattled to a stop. And we were all really glad to be down. So, we go to the gate, and, guys stand up, they start walking out, and I'm walking up the aisle, and one of the pilots steps out of the cockpit, and I look at him and I recognize him. I go, "Vern, oh, hey, it's great to see you." And we stepped aside and started talking. It's like, of course, it makes perfect sense now. And I thought, okay, that's why we had such a trouble. And it's kind of an amusing story. I think it was really kind of ironic. But the reason I bring it up is, I mean, in today's world, most of us feel like we're kind of sitting on the aircraft with Vern. We just feel like it's one thing after another, and that's been true for, I don't know, a decade or longer, but it's been particularly true of the last 5 years or so, where we just feel like how many things can go wrong in our country, and we kind of brace ourselves for the next thing. Well, I mention that because the subtitle of the book that this story comes from, which was 7 Miracles That Saved America, but the subtitle is the more important thing. I said, why they matter and why we should have hope. Because you're right, we're in a midst of turmoil. There's just no question that our society is really divided right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of anger. And that's not just because one person is president or another person is president. There's just a lot of angst in our society, and there has been for a while. We, of course, have wars in Europe, in Ukraine. We've got war in the Middle East. There's a great threat of a catastrophe if we have a conflict in the South China Sea, and the list goes on and on. And you have to wonder, well, what's the future of our country? And I want you to know that I think the future of our country is actually quite bright. And the reason I believe that is because I think God cares about our country. He's demonstrated again and again and again in our history that in really critical moments, when he feels as if there is no other alternative, he has stepped in and provided what I think are miracles in order to save our country. And I mean literally save our country. That was true in the foundation and the creation of our country, the miracle of the Constitution. It goes back to Jamestown. It's true in this incident we're going to talk about today. It was true during the Battle of Gettysburg and a number of other times. Why they matter and why we should have hope. If you believe God still cares about our country, then there is always reason to hope. So let's talk for a few minutes, I think, about this Battle of New York. As the sister said, as we introduced, this took place during the July months, July and August, during the summer months of 1776. And to review the history just a little bit, the war had been going on for, a little more than a year, about 15 months, since about April of 1775, when we had the Battle of Lexington and Concord. But the war hadn't really reached a pitch yet. The British were really just gathering their soldiers, collecting their army and their navy. The Americans were trying to do much of the same. Washington, as soon as he'd had this victory at Lexington and again Concord, he immediately started moving his army south toward New York City. Everyone knew New York City was the key to the future. For several different reasons, which I'll explain here in just a minute. If you were going to save the nation, this brand new nation that was really only, in many ways, only a few weeks old. It was only on July 2nd of 1776, just a few weeks before this battle really started to take shape, that the Congress had voted that they would separate themselves from Great Britain. And everyone again knew that the battle was coming. The focus of it, the first one, would be in New York City. You had to save New York to save the nation, and to defend the city, you had to defend the bluffs around the Long Island shore. And that's what the focus of this battle became about. Two great generals, General Washington and General Howe. And remember, General Howe was humiliated in Boston. He was angry. And he wanted to defend his reputation. He wanted to defend his military and his army and his navy, their reputation. And he wanted to defend the crown. He wanted to destroy this arrogant effort, he thought, of these rebels who had dared rise up against what was at the time the greatest empire in the world. And again, he knew that the battle that would matter most would be in New York City. So there were probably two or three reasons why New York City was so pivotal. The first reason was the British desperately needed the harbor there. It was the most efficient, the largest and the most critical harbor that was on the Americas at the time. And keeping in mind, the British had to supply their soldiers. They had to bring in their soldiers. They had to have a harbor where their ships could dock in order to be effective. Another reason was the British felt like they could divide and conquer. If they could control New York City, they could control the Hudson Valley River, which by and large separated the colonies at the time. And if they can control the Hudson Valley, then Hudson River Valley, then they could again divide the colonies and keep them from uniting in their efforts. And the third reason is that New York City was actually a hotbed of loyalists. By a lot of measures, the majority of people around New York City, Staten Island, Long Island, and others considered themselves loyal to the crown. And the British knew that if they could control and occupy New York City, they would be among many friendly people, and that was very, very important to them. In essence, then, New York City became the key to the whole continent. And we should keep in mind as well that the colonies didn't have a navy. I mean, no navy at all to speak of. And that the British, knowing the British had this, the world's largest navy at the time, they couldn't fight the British Army on the open sea. They couldn't fight the British Navy on the open sea. They couldn't fight the British Navy even in the Hudson River. The only way they could fight the British Navy was from the bluffs of Long Island. And so they quickly began to build small fortifications that they thought would give them, the guns and the protection in order to attack the British ships if they were to arrive or when they were to arrive there in the river. And while we're comparing navies between the British and the colonists, which there was no comparison, as I said, the British had the largest navy in the world. The Washington had virtually no navy at all. Let's talk just a little bit about their armies and the size of their army. Some press reports at the time claimed, this great victory at Concord, a mighty army under Washington's command. Some said they had 50,000 men. Some even said 70,000 men. But the reality is it was much, much smaller than that. The truth was that the entire army consisted of maybe 15,000 soldiers, and only maybe 7,000 of them were actually able to fight. Dysentery, malaria, a bunch of sicknesses and disease had swept through their army and really, really taken a toll. Maybe, as I said, maybe half of the men had become really quite ill. And in addition, it was a volunteer army, and this was the summer, and many of them came, the majority of them, that vast majority of them came from a farming background, and they had an abundant harvest that summer, and many of them felt like for the good of their family, for the good of their future, they had to go home and harvest their crops. So many of them left to do something they felt they had to do in order to, for the goodwill of their family. So what that left Washington with, was maybe 7,000 soldiers, maybe a few more, maybe a few less. The British, on the other hand, 400 ships, and they had already moved, or were in the process of moving, some 32 to 35,000 soldiers, and most of them were moving towards New York City. So on June 29th, the first of the British ships and soldiers began to arrive. 45 ships arrived that single day, and they disembarked at Staten Island. And within just a few days, the British encampment there was larger. It had more soldiers than the entire population of Philadelphia, which was the largest city among the colonies at the time. So overwhelming force, and clearly favored a British victory here. The Loyalists welcomed them. The British were well fed. They were healthy. They were rested, having just sailed across the oceans, and they were ready for a fight. They were restless. The army was restless. They were anxious to engage. Well, that continued for a few more weeks until July 12th. And that's when the British really exerted their first show of force. They sent two of their largest ships, the Phoenix and the Rose, up the Hudson River, right up the throat of the Hudson River. Really a brazen act of, some would claim arrogance, but they were just going to show their might, that they weren't afraid. In the middle of the day, these two ships sailed up the Hudson. They estimate more than 200 cannon shots were fired from the American forts. Not a single hit on the ships. They didn't hit a sail. They didn't break a mast. Not a single hit. And the two ships sailed north and positioned themselves where they could interdict any more supplies or any more reinforcements coming from the north. And that was really disheartening to the American troops to think they'd built Fort Sterling and a number of other forts and put cannons there. They thought, in order to attack the British warships while they were in the Hudson, and in their first engagement, it was humiliating. It was embarrassing that they couldn't seem to hit anything or inflict any damage. Well, for 5 more weeks, the British continued to bring in soldiers, ships, reinforcements, and supplies. Washington did what he could to build up his reserves, but there was very little that he could do. And so starting towards the latter part of August 21st, is when the real battle began. That day, actually for about a day and a half before the battle started, there was what they described as just a horrendous storm. It seemed to be just torrential downfall, and a constant barrage of lightning. Some men were so terrified of lightning they actually deserted and ran off into the woods. They had examples of soldiers horses that were so frightened by the lightning that they bolted, and some of them drowned in the river. And all of the soldiers just had to find whatever protection they could. And many structures in the city actually were struck by lightning and started on fire. But that morning, the storm had passed, and the sun came up, and it was fairly calm and clear. And at 8 o'clock, the British fired a cannon, signaling the beginning of the battle. And by 12 o'clock, there were 15,000 British soldiers that were marching towards the Washington and his army. Now, Washington had a decision to make. And in fairness to him, it was a difficult situation to know where he should be and where he should position his forces, but he actually made a terrible mistake. He didn't know if the British would attack Long Island or New York. So even though he was so outnumbered, he split his forces, and he put roughly half of them on the New York position, and the other half in Long Island. And in addition to splitting his men, there were 4 main roads that led towards their positions, and he guarded 3 of them, but one of them, a lesser known road called Jamaica Pass, was only guarded by 4 American soldiers. And he left it almost entirely unguarded. Well, that night, as the British were moving, a loyalist met with General Howe, and he told him about the Jamaica Pass. And in fact, he volunteered to guide him with a couple of his other farmer friends. And he said there's only a few Americans guarding Jamaica Pass. So General Howe made a decision. He took 10,000 of his men, and under the cloak of darkness, and in a great act of really brilliant deception, they kept their fires going. They kept their tents up. From the American positions, it looked like the British soldiers were not on the move at all. They were just resting for the night. But very quietly, they took 10,000 soldiers and moved them up the Jamaica Pass, where they would be in a position to attack Washington's soldiers from the flank, from the side. And the next morning, they started the main battle. The U.S. for a while thought they were actually winning. The British attacked them head on, and even though they are outnumbered, the Americans did pretty well. And in fact, like I said, for a few minutes, it appeared as if the Americans might actually be able to repel the British forces. But then the 10,000 soldiers attacked from the Jamaica Pass. Washington had no idea they were there. And what appeared like perhaps a victory quickly was not a standoff, and it wasn't even a defeat. It was turning into a massacre. It got so bad that General Howe actually commanded his men to stand down as the American soldiers retreated to Fort Sterling. But his men were, as I said, anxious to fight, and they could see it was a rout. They could see it was going to be a massive defeat. And they didn't quit fighting. And the general had to send out another order for them to stand down. And this gave Washington an opportunity to retreat with most of his men again to Fort Sterling. And it's important to note here that the British officers, they didn't want to capture territory. They knew that they didn't have the men and never would have the men to occupy all the colonies. The one thing they wanted to do was to destroy the army, destroy Washington's army, to kill men, to destroy supplies. If the colonists have no army to fight, it wouldn't matter if the British occupied all of them, and maybe over time they would. But for this time, their entire goal was simply to destroy Washington's army. Well, so now here they were that night. The few that remained were holed up at Fort Sterling. They were completely surrounded by British soldiers. As I said, more than 20,000 of them. And there was no way for them to retreat across the river. If they had tried, the British, anticipating that they might tried to position some of their ships in the river to intercept them. And they set sail late in the afternoon, and that's when the first really miraculous event occurred. And that is the wind suddenly shifted, and they began to blow harder and harder. And after a few minutes, there was a great northeast wind that made it impossible for the British to move their ships up to intercept Washington and his troops as they may try to retreat across the river. And it blew all that night, and it blew into the next day. And several times the British tried to sail against the winds, and they just simply were unable to do it, which left the river unoccupied and open. And the next night, Washington had to make a decision what they would do. And some of his advisors said, we must evacuate, we must cross the river. But that was extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, nothing is more dangerous and requires more precision and more discipline among an army than an organized retreat. I mean, imagine being some of the last men who are left behind to cover the retreat. I mean, their chances of survival or not being captured are, of course, very, very small. They had to be very quiet, not to alert the British in the nighttime what they were doing. It required enormous discipline for his soldiers not to break ranks. And as I said, they'd given up their cannons, they'd given up their trenches of protection. Much of their gunpowder was wet because of the rains. And for them to assemble on the docks where they would have to assemble and to try to go across the river in these small boats, it would have taken all night. And once the British knew that they were on the docks and that they were retreating, they certainly would have attacked and taken them when they were absolutely defenseless, no way to protect themselves. But having no other choice, Washington knew that's what he had to do. And so he ordered his soldiers, his leaders at least, to begin to organize a retreat. They told their men that they were going to have a secret night attack on the British soldiers. Now, the men were discouraged about that. They knew they were so outnumbered. They thought, this is crazy for us to go out and to attack the British right now. But they did that so they could maintain the deception that they were going to actually try to retreat across the river. And when the men began to assemble on the docks, that was the first time that they realized what they were doing. They put cloth and gunny sacks around the wheels of whatever carriages or cannons they thought they might be able to get out of the city so they could muffle the sounds. But they had a problem. As they began to assemble on the docks early in the evening, they had the same wind that had been keeping the British from sailing up the river to interdict them should they try to retreat. And they tried rowing across the river, but the winds were so fierce that they couldn't get a single boat, not even a small rowboat, to cross the river against these really strong northeast winds. And so how do you retreat when you can't cross the river? And this is where I think the second miraculous event took place, is as the men finally assembled and as they tried to cross the river and they were frustrated and realizing that they wouldn't be able to. And now they're very, very vulnerable because they've exposed themselves on the dock. Suddenly the wind shifted again. And for a few minutes it was calm. And then they shifted out of the southwest, which gave them a little bit of a tailwind as they could cross the river. So with the wind suddenly dying and then shifting, Washington ordered his soldiers to use the small boats that they had and to begin to row across the river and to evacuate. And all night long they did that. Some people crossing the river many, many times to bring other men over. But because of the late start and because they didn't have really significant ships and boats to evacuate thousands of men, as the sun started to rise, many of them were still left on the docks where they were exposed. And Washington knew that when darkness fell and the British could see, they would see them retreating and they would immediately attack. And all of the men left on the dock would be lost. But as the sun started to rise and as daylight came, what I think is the third miraculous event took place, and that is a deep, deep summer fog developed. over the river on on Washington side. They said it was so thick that if you were 5 feet in front of you, you were lost in the fog. If there was something 5 feet in front of you, you couldn't see it. And it was so thick that it actually muffled the sounds of what they were doing. And under this miraculous fog, and by the way, it's very, very unusual to have such thick fog develop in the summer months. The conditions for fog just is very rare to have that when it's warm. We all know that fog is mostly associated with cold or cool weather. And there's very, very little to explain meteorologically how this fog developed. But it was thick, it was there on time, and through that thick fog, George Washington and his last men evacuated and were able to find safety on the other side of the river. And when the fog lifted, the British, expecting to summon themselves for the final battle to destroy Washington and his army, and to destroy what was really the only fighting force the entire colonies had, bringing this war to a sudden end, the British expected, and to put down this rebellion from these arrogant colonists. Instead, the fog lifted and they looked across and couldn't see a single American as they'd evacuated to safety on the other side of the river, leaving the British no means to attack them. We have to ask ourselves, what would have happened if George Washington had not been able to escape? What would have happened if he had been captured and his army had been destroyed? It truly would have been the end of this rebellion. I mean, the independence of the United States would have been as short as a few weeks. As I said, the Congress had declared their independence just a few months before. And to say that it changed history is an understatement. And to say, in my view, that there were miraculous events that allowed this to take place, I think brings us back to the point that I started with and that I think is important. That is, if you think our nation matters, and if you think it matters to God still, if you think God has a role for our nation, and why that should give us hope as we look towards what seems to be a rather contentious and divided and a bit of a perilous future. I think we are strong enough to get through any challenge. Whether we like it or not, the United States is the glue that holds the world together. I have seen that again and again and again. As I've had a chance to travel all over the world, from Africa to the Middle East, to Asia, to China, through Europe, through Central and South America, I have seen it again and again. Whether we like it or not, the world looks to us for an example. They look to us for some chance of freedom and security. I understand why many of us Americans resent that, why we may tire of that. We can't be the world's policeman. As a member of the military, I have seen the stress that causes on our military and on our families. I've seen the stress it causes on supplies and munitions and our aircraft and our other weapons that we have to have in order to protect ourselves. It has been a strain for us. I have seen why it's difficult, but I also have seen the inevitable reality that is just the role that we have. And if America stumbles, the world crumbles underneath us. And I believe that's one of the reasons why God still cares about our country and why we hope, and many of us pray, that he will continue to provide miracles for us at critical junctions in our future. Hey, thanks for letting me come with you and tell you that story tonight. I love that story, the story of the summer fog. I appreciate that all of you are interested in our country, that you care about our nation, and I share with you in that love of our history and love of the foundation that we've been given. With that, are there any questions or comments that you guys want to talk about?
Is there anyone who'd like to start off with a question? Great, thank you. Come on.
Thank you very much. My question is about how did the churches...
Hey, before you go, do you mind if I ask your name and,
Sure.
and where you're from?
My name is Peter Haig. I'm from Orleans, Massachusetts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Peter, pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for this. Was wonderful. Wonderful to hear you. My question has to do with how did the churches and the people in New York, in these surrounding areas, handle this, particularly when there was divisions between the loyalists and the colonies or the colonialists? How did they handle it, and how did that affect their daily life? Thank you.
That's actually a great question. And I want to, before I begin, I want to caveat my experience. I'm not a historian. I don't have a PhD in the Revolutionary War or that history. And honestly, I'm kind of glad that I don't, because I view things through a lens of a storyteller. I view it through the lens of just, a common American guy who just, thinks these things are important. And it allows me, I think, to view it through a more common approach that I think maybe I would have lost if I'd had, really in-depth training or reading in history. But having said that, I think that, we spent actually years researching these stories, and I think I have a pretty good understanding of the background regarding them. The churches were divided. Like the rest of the colonies, but particularly around New York, and for us to, I think to be fair to them, we should appreciate, it's understandable why some of them were loyal to the crown. Many of them had only been in the colonies for a short period of time. Some of them had been there for a generation or two, but many of them were new to the colonies. The British Empire was the greatest empire at the time. And there was so much uncertainty about the future of America. What they were doing was so audacious. Can you imagine, this ragtag group of colonies taking on the greatest empire? So I understand their reservation. And finally, they felt loyalty to the crown. It would have been like some of us turning against the United States in some ways. The statistics of what we can determine at the time was somewhere between 40 and 60% of the local population in and around New York City were loyalist. Yeah. Staten Island, for example, had almost 60% of them were considered themselves loyal to the crown. And that was reflected in their churches. And it's important to keep in mind as well that almost everyone attended or participated in a church, either socially or for worship and devotion. So the churches were certainly not exempt from this, and it divided some of them. It divided most of them. I think that it's fair to say that the churches viewed themselves, I'm talking now about the church, not as a political and not as a military tool. I think they viewed themselves as someone who would provide comfort if they could, sanctuary if necessary. But I think they tried to do that in a fairly, I don't want to say bipartisan isn't the correct word, but, they weren't generally only favoring one or the other, with a few exceptions. But by and large, they just viewed themselves as trying to do, as I said, provide comfort and support. But it was difficult for the churches, and many of them really never quite recovered from it after the war. And it turned out, a lot of the loyalists left when it became clear that the colonies were going to win, or that they had. So there's a little bit of a self-sorting. But again, there's pretty clear evidence and stories of how many people took, years before some of those churches were united once again. Thanks, Peter.
Is there anyone else?
Great.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is John, and I also live in Orleans. I was wondering, are there any interpersonal stories from the Battle of Brooklyn? I feel like I hear a lot of stories about the SEALs now, and there's always a guy who had to run over there to grab the batteries for the other guy, and that let the evac come in. Is there anything like that that we know of in this battle?
Yeah, there are, and there are stories that I wish were well known, because there was great heroism displayed among Washington and his soldiers. And I think I'm gonna answer the question in kind of an odd way right now, but it's not really what you're asking, but it brings up something that I think is worth noting, and that is this battle was viewed as obviously as a great defeat for Washington, even though they were able to miraculously preserve their army. But if you go back and review the battle, General Washington made several really key mistakes. As I said, splitting his forces, leaving the Jamaican Pass unguarded. Their preparation, the fortifications, greatly overestimated their capability to fire shot, at a range that was sufficient to engage the naval ships in the river. There were a number of things that they did, and it would have been very, very easy for George Washington to have lost his confidence, and for the Congress to have lost their confidence in George Washington. And one of the lessons I take from this is the faith that he maintained in his army, and the faith that the Congress maintained in George Washington, and the fact that he didn't cower in the face of such a, what was, could have been just such a humiliating defeat, that he would have lost his courage and his position to lead his men, which was such an intense and personal form of leadership. Now, having said that, to your question, and I wish I could go over several of them, but I'll mention just one. There was, and this isn't someone running into the pitch of battle to save their friend kind of a story, but I think it's a great example of the courage that was displayed. There was a soldier who was assigned to be an observer on one of the bluffs. And his whole mission was to inform Washington of the movement of the British troops and the British soldiers. And when he became aware that there were soldiers moving up through Jamaica Pass, which, by the way, by the time he became aware of it, it was too late. It was, they were at the point where they could engage with Washington's army. So even for him to become to make Washington aware, it probably wouldn't have changed things. But he left his position to report this and moved his way through the British soldiers, in sometimes sprinting, sometimes hiding, but just committed to move through them and to get word to Washington that they were there. He was, the famous story of George Washington being shot and having volleys, gunshots through his clothes. This person had the same thing. He had a number of such close calls that he had gunshots through his hat, which he lost, and through his trousers. But again, he was committed to trying to inform the Washington's generals and his soldiers of the threat that was coming. There's I suppose hundreds of examples of that kind of bravery, and we don't hear or appreciate them as much as we should.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.
Andrew.
Good evening, Chris. My name is Andrew. I'm also from Orleans. My question to you has to do with your B-1 flight all around the world.
All right.
Now,
I'm glad you asked that. Thank you.
well, I'm coming up to the question. We are all aware of and very proud of our Air Force that on June 21st flew stealthily and took out the nuclear sites in Fordo without any loss of aircraft. So my question is this: when you flew all the way around the world, did you ever fly over hostile territory, first of all? Second, was your B-1 able to fly in a stealth mode? And third, was there a strategic reason why the U.S. had to fly around the world at that time?
Yeah. So those are great questions, and I appreciate you asking them. I really do, just because it's fun to talk about flying. I mean, if you're a pilot, you love talking about flying, right? And by the way, you cut out on me just a little bit, but I think I got the gist of your questions. Well, first, I've got to congratulate and thank the air crews, as you said, that did this remarkable mission to great success, and not a mission that didn't have threat. Obviously, their lives and that mission was in danger, and it's just remarkable that they were able to do what they did with the accuracy that they did, and to do it in such a way that they didn't have any losses. The flight that we did was actually to set the table for that kind of mission. You know, at the time, it's not like we said, "Hey, what should we do this week?" Well, maybe let's go set some world speed records. I mean, the Air Force never would have approved that type of mission. So the B-1 at the time was flying regular. We were practicing bombing missions, flying from the United States over to the Middle East, where we'd go through our practice bomb runs. We were not at war at the time, and this was after the first Gulf War. But we knew that we wouldn't be able to position B-1s in the theater. And if we were going to use them, and they're very, very effective weapon systems, B-1 can carry 84 500-pound bombs and drop every one of them exactly where they're supposed to be. And then much more sophisticated and some bigger weapons as well. So we were flying to the Middle East and doing our bomb runs and coming back home. And these were, 18, 20-hour missions. And as we were preparing for one of them, I thought, hey, we're about going about a third of the way around the world. What if we just kept going? Why don't we go all the way around the world? And we can demonstrate the combat capability, the range, the payload. We carried bombs with us and dropped them on 3 different bombing ranges around the world. One in the Mediterranean, one off the coast of Japan, and then one here near where I am tonight on the Utah Test and Training Range. So we demonstrated the ability to drop weapons anywhere in the world. And by the way, we were never, I'll put it this way. Every one of our bombs were directly on target, and we were plus or minus 1 second from our planned bombing time. So we did this world mission within plus or minus a second of our timing, and every bomb hit the target. So that's what we were trying to do, demonstrate the combat capability of the B-1. Well, as we were planning this mission, I asked another question, and that is, we're going to go around the world. I wonder what the world speed record is for doing that. And we did some investigation and found out, man, we're going to destroy that record. We're going to go much faster. I think the previous record was like 52 hours, as I recall, something like that, maybe 54. We flew around the world in 33 hours and 13 minutes, I think, or maybe it's 36 hours. It's been a while since I thought about it, but it was, much, much faster than the previous record. But the whole point of it was to demonstrate that global power projection, which brings us to now the mission that was flown recently. And the preparation that those pilots had to go through as they flew for about the same amount of time. One other kind of fun fact on that, sitting in an ejection seat aircraft flying is really, really hard on your body. Brooks Laboratories, which is a physiological lab for the Air Force, tells us that sitting in an ejection seat aircraft flying is the same stress on your body. If you do that for 1 hour, it's the same stress on your body as flying in rush hour traffic for 4 hours. And we were in the aircraft flying for 30 something hours. So we were very, very tired. They had monitors on us, and we had 2 planned periods of rest for 15 minutes. And when we were debriefing, they asked me, "Did you sleep?" And I said, "No, we never did. It was too busy." They came back about a week later and said, "Well, you did fall asleep right here." And I said, "Well, if I did, I don't remember it." So we wanted to test the duration of the air cruise as well, not just the aircraft. I mean, for those guys who flew last month, they needed to know, yeah, you can sit in an airplane, you can fly it for 36 hours and still be able to perform. So there's actually some correlation that ties the two of them together. I know we're almost out of time. Sister Dwyer, I don't know if you want to do one more question. I don't want to outlaw my welcome.
I would love to. If no one else has one, I have one. Chris, I was wondering, in the crossing, when Washington had his men leave the docks, cross the river, it makes me think of Dunkirk, and I know it's a very different scenario, but were there locals who helped ferry the rebels, or was it only themselves?
There, as far as I know, and I could be wrong on this, that's actually a great question, and it could be that I knew and I've forgotten, but as far as I recollect, there were none who were involved directly.
Okay.
There were some who they either loaned or the Army kind of confiscated their boats, but I'm not aware of any civilians who were aiding the retreat. Part of the reason I think that's true is that no one knew they were going to do it until just a few hours before. And the civilians had evacuated the area. You know, they knew the battle was coming, and then when the battle unfolded, they clearly didn't want to be caught in the middle of it. And then when the Americans were beginning to be routed, so I don't think there were any civilians who were left in the area who could have helped them. As you said, Sister Dwyer, it's a little bit different than Dunkirk, where you had, I mean, as you remember, the Churchill called for everyone to come and help, everyone with a dinghy, you know, to come across the British Channel, and you know, a lot of heroic effort there. This situation was a little bit different, I think, much more short term, much more intense timing, and frankly, probably a little more dangerous for the civilians.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very, very much, Chris. Thank you for being our first speaker, and thank you for giving us such a wonderful evening, both your shared experience and your knowledge. We really appreciate it.
It's been an honor, and thank you for what you're doing. I'm going to be watching as the months unfold, and what you're doing is very important, so it's an honor to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, all of you, for coming tonight. And please come back on September 20th, and we will be covering the Battle of Saratoga.